Can you hear? Okay. So I think all of us who are going to be here are here. I just want to say hello and welcome to class number 4 of the Diamond Sutra. Thank you all for making time to do this. I am doubly impressed by the fact that some of you are dealing with very challenging circumstances. Some of you are traveling and meeting via grocery store, which still tickles me. So I guess I wanted just to start off with a quick check-in. How is it going with the class? How is it going with the readings? Any big picture questions coming up that maybe we could talk about in this particular class period? So I'm going to mute myself and while you guys take some turns answering questions. So how about if we go Shokai, Laura, Kemyo, Choan, Teiko, Kakuan, in that order, and we'll see what happens.
Okay. I'm beginning to catch on. I finally figured out that the one who is not to create a self, etc., is the one who's aspiring to be a bodhisattva, not the target person.
Laura?
Well, I just I found this part really interesting just because they spend all this time talking about all this detail about what people are supposed to do and all the intricacies of the teaching, but it's almost like Buddha it's like he spent all this time writing things on a whiteboard or a chalkboard, and then down the line in these chapters, he takes the eraser and he just erases it all and says, well, basically, if you try to be a good person and you attempt to do the 3 perfections and try to do everything well and study and teach, then you can go ahead and jump ahead and skip all of the pain and the suffering that I had to go through and all these other people have gone through, because you're teaching, you're sharing, and you're meditating, and you're working on everything really hard. And then Subhuti is like, how can that be? How can that be? And then he kind of understands that some people can just jump ahead if they really are committed and they have all this in their heart. And I found that to be really interesting, and I wasn't quite sure if I understood it correctly. But then Red Pine, when in the commentary, talks about that. And then Khan's, he's like, this doesn't make any sense at all. I'm just going to skip over this part. So I just thought it was pretty good. And I'm interested in what Joshin has to say about it.
Thank you. Kemyo?
I enjoyed the analogies in these chapters, but my favorite one was from chapter 16. If we plant a melon seed, we get melons. And if we cultivate an inconceivable teaching, can our harvest be anything other than inconceivable? Or something. I don't know. I like that. I like analogies.
Kakuan?
I love to be ruled by objects. I don't know if it's the section of the sutra that we've hit or where my head is at, but there is a sense of getting things in a general sense that came on the last couple of weeks. Like seeing the teachings from the first 12 chapters as elements that add into like actually what that means in terms of perfecting wisdom and like why we care and why it's good at doing the things it's good at doing. So that was nice. You know, it's been a nice 2 weeks with these 4 chapters.
Okay. Joanne?
Well, life has been really crazy, so I only managed to read 1 chapter. And when I was reading it, I was so distracted, I think, and could not really focus. I kept reading a little bit and putting it down, reading it again. By the time I was done, I was like, okay, none of this is making any sense. So, and that's as far as I got. So I'm kind of struggling with it this last 4 weeks just because of life. But hopefully things will settle before long and I'll be able to focus a little bit more.
Okay, thank you. Teiko?
So I didn't find these 4 chapters didn't hook me intellectually or emotionally very much. Not really. And I felt validated by what Kansei said about what other people found it. I forget now the adjectives, but it was like tedious. But anyway, but what I did think about was there's with the emphasis, all the emphasis on the merit accumulated by teaching these words, you know, enormous amounts of merit. I just thought it was kind of curious that Buddhism didn't become much more evangelical than it seems to me to be.
Interesting, interesting. Huh, okay, okay. So one thing I want to toss out at you in terms of a question to ponder is it has to do with that transformative aspect of the teachings in the Diamond Sutra. And part of this comes from the fact that at Wy'East last Wednesday, we read a section on karma and rebirth. And this was a section written by Kyogen, and he had a particular take on it. And yet so much of these chapters that we read for today's class in the Diamond Sutra says that, you know, if you understand the teachings on the perfection of wisdom, then bad karma can be ameliorated, right? And I very much remembered my discomfort at answering some of the questions at the Wy'East class when we were talking about karma and rebirth, because I know the people whose questions I was answering did not have a relationship to these teachings. And so my question for you, and this can be a discussion if we handle our muting and unmuting well, is how important is it for people to have a good sense of Buddhist teachings before encountering this teaching of the perfection of wisdom? What happens when people encounter? We had this mention of this teaching being one of the most spiritually traumatic events of a practitioner. And how then do you explain some of these teachings to those who come after you in such a way that they're accessible? Or do you withhold the teachings until you feel they're ready? So this is putting you all in the teacher seat, so to speak. And how would you approach sharing these teachings? Does that make sense? Do you understand what I'm asking you? Okay. And I'll let you guys figure out who's just go.
Well, I'll just jump in and say that I appreciate your sharing that you felt just uncomfortable with those questions because I had the opposite experience with that conversation. I left feeling like it was just such a nourishing, satisfying conversation, and especially serious. So glad that you were there. And I thought because the questions that came up were great questions, and if you hadn't been there, I mean, you know, would have been okay, I guess. But I don't know.
It was less my discomfort of the questions and more I was very careful in how I answered them.
Yeah. I mean, your answers seem to me just pitched exactly right. I mean, they were easy to understand. I thought they spoke directly to the questions, and more importantly, the people who asked them seemed to be well satisfied.
Okay, but my question for this group, for this class right now, really is more along the lines of, does encountering this teaching of the perfection of wisdom change your understanding of karma or your relationship to karma? And how would you share that shift in understanding if it takes place with others?
I'm not answering, but Laura, can you mute until you're talking? I think it's your background.
How do I do that? Where's the menu?
I just
Lower right, lower left-hand corner in my screen.
Okay. No, I'll work on that, you all,
Okay.
because it's the road noise. I need to go back to the menu. There.
Yeah, it's different when you're on a phone. There you go. Good job.
I don't think I can speak to your question, Joshin, because I don't understand the message of the sutra.
Okay, fair enough. Anybody else?
The message of the sutra that I understand is not challenging. I mean, it's impossible, but it's not.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change things for me. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Joshin, this is Laura. Are you referring to sort of like how Buddha and all the teachers in these books, they explain everything step by step, and their goal, it seems like, is they want you to understand certain concepts before they introduce the next one, because one thing builds on another thing on another thing.
Yep.
And it sounds to me like you had some discomfort with leaping around without feeling like somebody sort of gotten a glimmer on some of these prior concepts before they start talking about something else. Like the whole idea about escaping karma. And in this section, in these chapters that we read, he talks about how you can basically escape your karma by good works, and that you're not stuck with this awful karma. But if somebody hasn't really learned about or been exposed to the ideas about merit and the perfection of wisdom and the precepts and all those things, and they could think, well, it's just really easy and it goes away. So I can kind of see what you're talking about and what you're asking. And I guess people want to jump ahead maybe. So maybe the thing to do is to tell people, yes, it's essentially hopeful. You're not stuck with your karma, but it takes a lot of effort to get to that place, or some, just to let people know that it's not something that you can just snap and get.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
Yeah, Mia.
So, Joshin, I was having a big reaction to chapter 12. And so in between this last class and this class, Joshin and I met here at Dharma Rain, and I have in my notes from that conversation that I was describing a feeling of recognition or familiarity when I first started sitting. And Joshin said, the name you put on it in that moment was wisdom, that I was hearing wisdom. That was the quality of familiarity. And what I wrote in my notes was, I intellectually understood Joshin, but reflecting on that exchange, I think she jumped ahead of where my apprehension is. I don't have insight or realization about prajna. But so I wrote that, and then I continued reading these chapters. And for me, Joshin, you pointing to that, even if in the moment I didn't feel like I connected with it at a non-intellectual level. When I then kept doing the readings for this week, there was that part of me that was then looking for a different kind of realization of prajna, of the perfection of wisdom. So as a teaching kind of strategy, it was helpful to me as a student to have the teacher point me in the direction a little bit, even if in that moment it didn't fully land.
Part of why I'm posing this question to you is that oftentimes in Zen we talk about putting aside books and letters and just dealing with the spontaneous aspect of life. And and in a way, the Diamond Sutra speaks to that a little bit, that ability to dive wholeheartedly into experience, to not cling to a self. But part of what's important is to learn the foundations before you set them aside or jump ahead or let go of. And with teachings like this is not something I would teach to an intro class, right? Somebody coming in from the secular world and encountering these teachings, it can be very, very confusing. So I'm saying that by means of, in a way, saying thank you for your diligent study in getting to this point, in being able to read this sutra and sticking with it, because it's not easy material and it's not straightforward material, and it's designed to bypass that linear, intellectual, structured view. So it's teaching us not just to understand the sutra, but to cultivate a view. Does that make sense? Okay. So do we want to start going through these chapters and pulling out juicy tidbits? Deiko had asked a question. She had to leave, but she had asked a question about why Buddhism wasn't more proselytizing with the emphasis on merit, and I'm going to let that roll around in my head as we go through these chapters, and we'll see what comes out later. Sound good? Okay. Where are we at? Chapter 13? We're at the halfway point of the class series, by the way. I just wanted to point that out. After reading this section, I was like, wow, we must be done. And we are not done yet. Chapter 13. Does somebody want to read chapter 13? Not the commentary, but just the sutra part.
I don't have my book with me. I'm not at home, and I don't have my book with me. So
Okay, there's 4 other choices.
I can read it.
Thank you.
Chapter 13. This having been said, the Venerable Subhuti asked, Bhagavan, what is the name of this Dharma teaching and how should we remember it? The Buddha told the Venerable Subhuti, the name of this Dharma teaching, Subhuti, is the perfection of wisdom. Thus should you remember it. And how so? Subhuti, what the Tathagata says is the perfection of wisdom, the Tathagata says is no perfection. Thus is it called the perfection of wisdom. Subhuti, what do you think? Is there any such Dharma spoken by the Tathagata? Subhuti said, no, indeed, Bhagavan, there is no such Dharma spoken by the Tathagata. The Buddha said, Subhuti, what do you think? Are all the specks of dust in the billion world system of a universe many? Subhuti said, many, Bhagavan. The specks of dust are many, Sugata. And how so? Because Bhagavan, what the Tathagata says is the speck of dust, Bhagavan. The Tathagata says is no speck. Thus is it called a speck of dust. And what the Tathagata says is a world system, the Tathagata says is no system. Thus is it called a world system. The Buddha said, Subhuti, what do you think? Can the Tathagata, the Aran, the fully enlightened one, be seen by means of the 32 attributes of a perfect person? Subhuti said, no, indeed, Bhagavan. The Tathagata, the Aran, the fully enlightened one, cannot be seen by means of the 32 attributes of a perfect person. And why not? Because Bhagavan, what the Tathagata says are the 32 attributes of a perfect person, Bhagavan. The Tathagata says are no attributes. Thus are they called the 32 attributes of a perfect person. The Buddha said, furthermore, Subhuti, if a man or woman renounce their self-existence every day as many times as there are grains of sand in the Ganges, and renounce their self-existence in this manner for as many kalpas as there are grains of sand in the Ganges, and someone grasped but one four-line gatha of this Dharma teaching and made it known and explained it to others, the body of merit produced as a result would be immeasurably, infinitely greater.
Super. Thank you. How'd you guys feel about chapter 12? Good, bad, weepy?
I found all the repetition to make me a little sleepy when I was reading a lot of this. It's very lulling because of all the
Yeah.
repetition. And I find myself, sort of skimming, oh, this is another repetition. And so I don't pay attention as much. And then all of a sudden it'll switch and I go, oh, now they're saying something. They're not just repeating. But it did make me a little sleepy.
Yeah. If you're learning this by heart, the repetition helps a lot. And if you ever read, if we ever do a class on the Avatamsaka Sutra, you'll have pages and pages and pages of repeating lists of names and concepts. So if you do sutra study, get used to repetition. Oh, but I do understand it. It is sleepy making. I found I was doing that as well from time to time. I just lost my place. Okay. All right.
Page 212. I have marked up
Page what?
the 212.
212.
End of the paragraph from Shang Yi.
Mm-hmm.
From the point of view of prajna wisdom, the dust of our delusions arrives from nowhere and departs from nowhere. Its nature is empty.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, it is not the dust of delusions. I wish that last sentence weren't there. That's where I don't make the jump. But it arrives from nowhere and departs from nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
I almost understand what's intended here.
And what is intended that you almost understand?
Yeah, that these delusions, this dust just exists. It actually doesn't come from somewhere. It already is here. It doesn't go anywhere. It already is here. We get them. We get these delusions. I don't know.
Its nature is empty.
What the hell does that mean? Sorry. Its nature is empty.
Well, that's a lot of what the entire sutra is talking about.
That's what I noticed.
Yeah.
That I don't get it. But let's keep going.
Okay. Its nature is empty. There is no permanent abiding thingness to
That I heard Wednesday evening, and I began to get a glimmer. No, the emptiness to me, that emptiness it's full of something. It's full of everything instead of empty of everything. But
each thing is empty. Each thing's own nature is empty of intrinsic existence. It is fleeting. It is changeable. It is impermanent.
Okay.
And we tend to think of things as permanent, as a fixture. And we identify things and put labels on them that imply permanence and intrinsicness. A delusion is just a label that we impart on an experience that itself is made up of smaller bits or bigger bits.
Okay. Which might relate to particles of dust. Huh?
Maybe. But a particle of dust is only a particle of dust because you've named it such and viewed it as such. To an ant, a particle of dust might be a boulder.
Yeah, yeah.
And in ant language, it might be called something else entirely that your ears probably wouldn't even hear.
Yeah.
So when we start talking about emptiness, relationship becomes important.
And you can take that relationship down to the very, clear deck. It's turtles all the way down. It's
turtles all the way down. Yeah. Yeah. Objective reality is objective because we assume it to be objective. And that the Buddhist view of reality is dependent upon our view and learning that our view is simply our view, which
all
is
the
as
things
empty, which is as empty as anything else.
Each markup in this chapter in my book has the word emptiness in it.
Mm-hmm. Welcome to the Diamond Sutra.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Prajnaparamita teachings.
Okay. Maybe.
You're getting there.
Building off of that, if you go back a few more pages, hold on. Here we go, page 207.
Okay.
I got that marked too. Go ahead.
Yeah, we had the same one marked last time too.
I don't know.
The
Go
end
ahead.
of the first paragraph, the last sentence. So this was helpful to me, but then led to another question. For emptiness means absence or negation, while the perfection of wisdom means the absence or negation of what is false, not the absence or negation of what is real. That's great, but then my next question is, how do I tell the false from the real?
Mm-hmm. All right, let's parse this through. Emptiness means absence or negation. That's a conventional meaning of emptiness. That's sort of the common usage emptiness. And there are two kinds of negations in Buddhist logical systems. There's affirming negations and non-affirming negations. So an affirming negation will be something like, my car is not red. So it negates something, but it also implies the presence of something else. And a non-affirming negation is what the teachings of emptiness are, in that there's the negation, but it never implies anything else, right? So for emptiness means absence or negation, while the perfection of wisdom means the absence or negation of what is false, not the absence or negation of what is real. And your question is, how do you know? Right?
Yeah, how do you discern the false from the real?
Mm-hmm. How do you define real?
Yes, that's my question.
Take a stab at it.
Well, I guess part of what tripped me up was that when I was reading the sentence, I expected that second part to not say what is real, but what is true. Like, I think of true as being the opposite of false.
Mm-hmm.
And there's other parts in the sutra, or at least in the commentary, where it feels like true and real are being used interchangeably.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And it depends on who's speaking and what view they're professing.
I think for me, that's the clue, is the view piece that we were just talking about. And so part of practicing the precepts or practicing the paramitas is a kind of embodied way of living out what is true, as a way of distinguishing between that and what is false.
Mm-hmm. So if the perfection of wisdom means the absence of what is false, what are you left with?
I think for me, that was part of the good news. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I got out of the word gospel, which I think translates to the good news, of the teachings of Jesus anyway, was it's not a nihilistic emptiness. It's not that there's nothing.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, this particular sentence is pointing us towards the perfection of wisdom is not a negation of what is false. It upholds what is real. And so the perfection of wisdom is not the negation of what is real, which might be implied if you are using the term emptiness to mean nothingness.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that things don't exist.
Yeah.
Right? It just means that they don't exist in the way that we imagine them to exist, or that we conceptualize them to exist, or we impute them to exist.
Yes.
So the teachings of emptiness don't deny conventional reality, but it says that they're impermanent, these things that we encounter, that we ourselves are impermanent and lacking a self. Yeah, good?
Yeah.
Does that work for people?
It seems to me that they're basically saying that our perception is all relational, and as such, it doesn't really have a meaning or that just by looking at something, we put a meaning or a definition or an attribute to it, but there is still something there separate from us having viewed it. And so what we have to do is somehow get a grasp the idea of being able to interact with reality without that relational kind of interchange happening. At least that's the way I see it. It's kind of like something doesn't really exist until you see it in a lot of ways, or you feel it, or you smell it, or you sense it. That doesn't mean that it's not there, but it means that in your world, it really, now it exists. And it seems like with this perfection of wisdom, what they're wanting us to do is to try to get beyond that.
I would flip that.
Okay, help me with that, because
Yeah.
I'm on the edge of it.
Mm-hmm. So instead of saying to get past that relational aspect or to drop it, I would say we embrace it and realize that everything we encounter is already flavored by our own mind. We've already imputed our, it's come to us through our karmic filters. We have already imputed some positive, negative, or neutral attribute to it. And this is what the mind does. This is what part of having a human mind does. So instead of trying to strip our experiences of that which we impute on reality, instead it's to see that we impute all of this stuff on reality. And then through that, we see our own mind. Everything I remember being in college as an undergrad, taking a graduate level, some sort of biology class. And it was a seminar class, and one of the instructors tripped me up and actually embarrassed me in front of the class, which was my own stuff, by holding up a butterfly and asking the class, what color is it? And of course I said, it's yellow. And he said, how do you know? And I said, well, because I see it. He says, well, your sense of this only exists in your mind. And I said, no, there's a butterfly. It's yellow. And he's like, no, you see it as yellow. You know, an insect with a view of the ultraviolet spectrum might see something else entirely different. And I was like, ah, shit, okay, he got me. But in a way, these teachings of emptiness are pointing us towards that fact that like we view reality in a really skewed way, with ourselves as the center of the universe, as a solid self, and with this vast array of objects and sensations that surround us, that we move through this world of things, and that we know what they are, which is also a delusion, that we know any of this. Where was I going with that?
There are plenty of psychological and not even psychological studies about we create our own reality. We see what we expect to see, and I figure that's these heaps and aggregates are bunches of memories of what we have seen before, and this must be another one of those. And sure enough, it might not. It might turn out not to be. I'm thinking of, you all know this, the observers who were hired by the psychologist to count the basketball passes from the black and white team, and the gorilla shows up and they didn't notice the gorilla.
Yeah.
That's just one of many, many examples of creating our own reality.
Yeah.
Ask any lawyer who wants eyewitnesses to an event.
Yeah.
That's where I'm seeing this come into my life. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did I help or hurt what you were talking about?
I think you took it a little further out than I wanted to go. I'm still trying to keep this towards internal experience. In our relationship to the world, there's an aspect of seeing this that allows the self to get out of the way. And when the self gets out of the way, when the small self gets out of the way, then experience just becomes experience. And that sense of self is only one amongst a variety of experiences that are encountered in a mind moment. So my sense of self, me as a person, is just one of a variety of things that are occurring in this moment. Does that make sense? Maybe? Kakon smiling. Oh.
Am I on mute?
Now I can see you. Sometimes your face disappears and it just says Kakawan. But one of the great...
Right, but I'm not on mute.
You're not on mute.
Okay. Yeah. No, I'm smiling because, like, I've sarcastically said back and forth to my best friend for years, like, you know, X is just like an idea, man. And we went really far with it for like 18 months. We were just like, you know, you're just like an idea, man. You know, and it like, this feels like something has come up and like gently shoved me face first into that. Like, no, really, you know. And I finally underlined something in this on 213, which is like, I may as well say it's me, right? Mm-hmm. Like that to me is really what's leaping out in this chapter, is like, you can't get out from under it. You know, we can't get out from under our minds. We can recognize clearly that there's a like unavoidable scrim of delusion that like is just going to flavor all of it. Mm-hmm. And there's a lightness to acknowledging this and working with this that this text is bringing that I have personally not found as present in other things. Like, I think it's just as present in some Zen stuff, but less, like a little bit more poetic and a little bit more focused on like mm-hmm. trying to hone clarity as much as possible. Whereas this is like, dude, just get real about the fact that there's a certain level of not with it that you're going to have. Get really real with that. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, then start honing and come back and get real again. Very lively, you know?
Yeah. There's oftentimes when I've seen people come to practice and there's this sense of, I want to know everything and I want to know everything right now and I want to figure it out. And once I figure it out, everything will be okay. And it takes time to work with these things because oftentimes there's a component of transformation that is not intellectual, that comes in its own time, in its own way, that often takes people by surprise. And it can't be rushed. And there's nothing wrong with not understanding. I actually enjoy not understanding because it gives me something to lean into. If I feel like I've got it all figured out, then something's not right. And Kakawan, you are just an idea.
Man.
Yeah.
Two ideas meeting.
Yeah. Joanne?
You know, well, you know this about me, Joshin. I really want to just be able to sit with my paper and pencil and read through and very analytically be able to understand it. And sometimes I feel like I can just go, if I was to just look at you every time and say, I don't get it, say it in a different way. I don't understand. I don't understand. I don't understand. At some point, you're going to say it in a way that this light bulb goes off. And every once in a while, the light bulb goes off and you say it or somebody says it in a way that I go, oh my God. But then it disappears again. And I have to hear it a bazillion ways again to get it. And when you were talking at the beginning today of if somebody from the Sangha or something came up to us and was talking to us about it, do we need to have this? I think part of that question, do we need to have something else before this? And I actually think that if I absolutely needed to have time before I came into the Diamond Sutra, even though I still don't get almost everything we talk about. At least now there is this familiar, almost like feeling. It still doesn't feel like it's familiar up here, but there's something that my body, I resonate with, that I go, that my body feels like, oh yeah, I've heard that before. Even though my brain isn't saying, I still understand, that I'm understanding it. So,
You can trust that.
I've been told so many times, just let it wash over you. You don't necessarily have to understand it. Just let it wash over you. And you've led me to poetry. You've led me to different places to see if it will filter in another manner. And I do feel like it's filtering in. I don't know that I understand it any more than I ever did, but there is something happening that I don't understand, but I know that it's happening.
Good. That's something to celebrate.
I guess so.
So there's something in this that you're recognizing on a visceral level, which is phenomenal. And I can say something to you again and again, or you can hear it from somebody else, and that light bulb goes off, and that light bulb has nothing to do with the fact that I'm saying it. It has everything to do with the fact that you're ready to hear it. So be patient with yourself and know that having that visceral reaction of recognition is a part of understanding this. That the brain aspect, the intellect aspect may come later. And articulating this is so challenging because we are trying to speak to that which cannot be spoken of. Right? It's really hard. And when we try to read somebody else's words about what is essentially a very specific view, it's easy to get caught on the words as we're trying to find the view. So struggling with the words is important because it allows that time and that space for that visceral recognition to come up. Does that make sense?
It does, but if somebody from the Sangha came and asked me to explain it to them, I'd go, it's something in here somewhere. You just need to go talk to my teacher because I can't. I can't give you what you're looking for.
Yeah. And there were years when I would be talking to my peers in the Sangha and something would come up about emptiness. And I'm like, dude, I don't get it. There's something there about emptiness. This is what I think it might mean. I'm pretty sure I'm wrong, but this is where I'm at right now. And saying, this is my understanding right now is perfect because this transformation is a transformation of view and there's a progression. And like part of what we have to do is to see all of the misses in order to find the hits. Otherwise, we don't recognize them.
I see the misses.
Pardon?
What do you mean? Can you give an example of this?
Like struggling with some of these ideas, knowing that you're off the mark. Having that feeling of being tripped up and not fully understanding. Without going through that and without working through some of the language or getting a sense of the language, it's easy to think that a particular take on this is the right one.
I'm not having that experience, but yes, I know what you mean. I don't
And
find anything easy or right about going through the sutra.
yeah, it's hard stuff. And like part of the transformation is not just intellectual or verbal. Like I can watch people's bodies shift as they work with these teachings. So it's an embodied recognition. It's not just an intellectual understanding. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, because it took me forever to write the reflection for
Mhm.
this. Like, I can't write about it anymore, it feels like.
Yeah. This is why I'm fascinated by articulation of the Dharma. This has been one of my practice koans for the last 2 years, and I get so excited, like if somebody does a student talk, because I really want to see how they express something that is so hard to express. And everybody does it differently. Everybody will use different metaphors. And oftentimes we start off and the first thing we do is we quote our ancestors. And then we get nudged to say it in our own way. And what happens then? How do we say it? It's so much fun. It's so frustrating. It's both at the same time. All right, chapter 14. Page 224. I'm not going to have us read chapter 14 because it's a couple of pages long. On 224, Red Pine is talking about Subodhi being overwhelmed. And then a couple sentences down, this is an example of what later became known as the sudden enlightenment school of Buddhism, in which the emotional impact of a teaching does what meditation and reflection are unable to do. I love this. There's that very clear, like, reason and analytics aren't going to do it. This is where that leaping beyond comes from. It's recognizing that emotional shift.
But can I just add, meditation is really helping me. Like,
Yeah.
the experience of staying on the cushion when I'm not on the cushion is really helping me weather the emotional storms of working through the sutra.
So this is not saying don't meditate. This is contrasting it to other schools of Buddhism where logic and analytical meditation are used to understand the teachings.
Sounds awful.
Analytic, like it. I've been in school with Tibetans for 4 years now, and it was just last semester I finally figured out what the hell they were talking about when they said analytic meditation. Took me a long time. Not my favorite form of meditation. Sorry, Rinpoche. Yes, so this is a plus for Zen students, this particular take that Red Pine has. And it's also a contrast to the way like the way people had been practicing. There are stages and there are progressions. It takes a long time to become enlightened. And we're at this part of the sutra where Subodhi is realizing that it might not take kalpas and kalpas and kalpas. That this is where we start to get this this glimpse that enlightenment could happen within a lifetime by a person who is hearing these teachings. That's a big shift from being told that your practice right now is to produce merit so you'll have a better rebirth, and then maybe in a few millennia you can become a bodhisattva and then get enlightened. This is a radical shift from what had been done before. I didn't have too much underlined in this chapter. I did have on 229, Pussy says for an ordinary person to believe this teaching is like a lotus rising from a fire. There's a temple in New York called Fire Lotus. And I hadn't realized that this is where that name came from. Just like Dharma Rain comes from the Lotus Sutra. You were going to ask a question, Chokai.
Back on 224, where you were talking, here's an example, and the freedom from perceptions that are no perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
The perceptions that are no perceptions are those the ones that are you didn't expect them to be. Is that why it's no perceptions?
That and perceptions themselves are empty. So what is the emptiness of a perception?
It says here it's not related to anything else. It has no independent existence.
It itself is empty.
Never mind.
It's easy. So it's easy for Subhuti here to be caught in a definition of emptiness. The perceptions being no perceptions. The Buddha nudges him one step further to not even be caught by ideas of emptiness, because emptiness itself is empty. Which, when I follow that logic all the way through to its endpoint, like I can go through emptiness and end up in dependent origination, end up in the arising of every single thing in this moment, arising together, codependently, interdependently. So you end up with interdependent co-arising. Each thing is
everything is connected.
Yeah.
Everything is a result of something.
And each thing arises interdependently with everything else.
Yeah. You can't take away any parts of it.
Yeah.
You can't even examine that part of it.
Yeah. So the whole universe arises together in each moment.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Good. What else do we have in this chapter?
I loved the poem on page 227. I don't know if I'm saying the name right. Dao Chuan. You know how like each of these
that one, yeah.
a little poem? Walking into the distance, traveling since your youth, crossing so many rivers, climbing so many peaks, until one day you find the road to your old home, and finally you realize how long a trip it's been. I thought that was lovely. I love these poems that they have at the end of the sections.
I had thought to challenge you all with this class today. Maybe I'll save it for another class and have you write some poetry. Because part of this is it gets so hard to articulate that sometimes you can only express it in poetry and point towards and use metaphor and simile and imagery and beautiful flowery words to express that which can't really be expressed.
Well, Choan, like, is that what you were saying a few moments ago, that sometimes tradition will give you poetry or something, or like, is that your experience of it, of reading poetry? Is that okay to ask each other questions? We haven't done that before.
No, you can ask each other questions. It's up to her if she wants to answer it.
I was just struggling so much with some of the teachings that she led me to go and read poetry that had nothing to do with Buddhism, like go to the library and find some poetry and just let it wash over me to see if I could connect through poetry, and then maybe if I could get that experience outside of the Buddhist teachings, then maybe I could come back and it wouldn't be so frustrating for me. But all that did was I went out there and read poetry, and that was frustrating too. So, like, okay, you need a different approach with me. That one didn't work.
Yeah. We learned something there.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So on 234, there's a paragraph that starts, the Lotus Sutra says. In that last line, those who want to leave samsara do not yet realize there is no samsara to leave. I remember my teacher Kyogen running around always saying, samsara and nirvana are not two. So with the view of emptiness, or with the view of non-duality, nirvana and samsara are simply two sides of one coin. So recognize that coin and not the sides. And yet when I teach, I still talk about samsara all the time, because it's you can't just jump to these teachings of emptiness and say, okay, you're really a Buddha, have at it, go have fun, have a good life. Because it's hard for, like, you just can't go there. Otherwise people get wrapped up in their delusions and see them for the truth, and that's not skillful at all. So we spend some time teaching about samsara and nirvana before we start saying there's no samsara to suffer and no nirvana to be had.
Well,
All right.
sometimes it just, Joshin, sometimes they say, you have to, like, first be confused before you can understand. And so maybe
Yep.
that's what you're getting at a little bit.
Yep. And, we still have our two truths, and conventional reality is still conventional reality. All right, it's 4:07 and we still have 2 more chapters. Do we want to move on to chapter 15? Which is also somewhat long-ish. So I want to point out on 254, last paragraph, Sheng Yi says, the physical body depends on karma for its existence and has no nature of its own, just as a wave depends on the wind for its existence and has no nature of its own. The sea is one while waves are countless. Billions of waves rise and fall during the morning. Billions of waves rise and fall during the midday. Billions of waves rise and fall during the afternoon. Thus, over the course of millions and trillions of kalpas, the number of illusory waves is far beyond reckoning. But all those illusions can't compare to the one reality. They can't compare to the sea. Noble sons and daughters are also like this. There is only one sea of our Buddha nature. But when people are confused, the sea of Buddha nature becomes the sea of consciousness. And the sea of consciousness becomes the sea of passion. And the sea of passion becomes the sea of karma. The sea of karma becomes the sea of suffering. And from the sea of suffering, they receive countless limitless karmic bodies. Thus, on top of confusion, they pile up confusion without end and without limit. But all those illusions can't compare to the one reality, namely the true form of all dharmas. But that was such a beautiful way of saying it. On 264, once again, the Buddha reminds us that this teaching does not come from Buddhas. Rather, Buddhas come from this teaching. I think that reminder comes multiple times in this sutra, and it's a good reminder that Prajnaparamita is the mother of all Buddhas. Anything else from chapter 15? All right, let's go on to 16. Sixteen was a little weird. This business of suffering contempt.
But it goes on to say that the suffering becomes the source of liberation. Suffering contempt. Not all suffering, it sounds like, but just suffering contempt that you get when you teach the Dharma.
Jobin used to say samsara is the cause of nirvana.
Mm-hmm.
So on 272, Hui Nang has a particularly lovely paragraph. Briefly put, your past lives are simply the deluded mind of your previous thoughts, and your present life is simply the enlightened mind of your subsequent thoughts. Use the enlightened mind of your subsequent thoughts to reject the deluded mind of your previous thoughts so that delusions have nowhere to cling. Thus it says that the moment your deluded thoughts are eliminated, the bad karma of your past lives is wiped away. And when bad karma is not created, you realize enlightenment. It makes it sound so very simple. I remember the first time I read the Diamond Sutra, I was a little bit pouty about that paragraph. That it wasn't that simple. On 274, Red Pine points out, in its simplest form, worship consists of the four material offerings: food, clothing, bedding, and medicine. The four things traditionally provided for monastics are food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. So that's part of where this list is coming from. I like the reminder to not confuse blessings with merit. What else comes up for you in this chapter? I don't have a whole lot pulled out for you. We still have 18 minutes. I might get through a whole section on time. I'm not hearing you, Kakawan.
Is he talking? Or
I think they're trying to talk.
okay, I'll mute mine.
Right now, all I see is the name Kakawan. I think they're...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Oh, beautiful.
Sounds like you're on a
Okay,
radio call-in show.
Yeah, it's the technology's difficult over here.
Yeah.
So, pursuant to an earlier conversation this week,
Yep.
institution, I found myself getting kind of spun up chapter about like this is how we get real twisted, get real twisted if people are clever enough to kind of get their hooks in this,
Mm-hmm.
that like in how to like ostensibly, how to deploy prajna to manifest prajna, but that this feels like it offers the potential for like, oh, I'm awake, so what I do is okay because my karma is going to be purified by this. I don't believe this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe this, and I don't even really think it's that big a deal, but it's interesting that thing that's like one of my things comes up with this chapter. Does that make sense?
It makes total sense. And there have been plenty of instances of abuse by Buddhist teachers who make that very claim, that all things are empty, so therefore my actions have no lasting consequences, and therefore whatever I do is okay. So this is why when working with these teachings, that also working with the precepts and the other paramitas is so important. And like the importance of Sangha can't be overstressed. Because when we work with these teachings on emptiness, when we work with these ways of changing views and working through delusion, we need somebody to be a mirror for us, because it's so easy to delude ourselves that we understand, or that because I've read this sutra, therefore my karma is cleansed and I'm not going to accumulate anymore. And we're still beings who can create all sorts of negative karma. Like we can still do so much harm. So the being that recognizes emptiness in this moment might not be the being that arises in the next moment. So there's still the opportunity to do harm. And so we need others around us to say, that's not skillful. Is that addressing your comment, Kakuan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. Is this chapter and like a lot of the classes here, like for me right now, kind of brush almost up against getting high on your supply.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that it's not like these commentaries aren't in a vacuum, but it's so interesting to me that around these parts, like I hear a lot about that to be one another practice.
You're cutting out.
Can you hear me now? I'm so sorry. This is like
That's
the worst
so much better.
possible. Okay. The commentary on 16, a lot of it, is flowery and lovely, and to me also brushes up almost on getting high on your own supply.
Mm-hmm.
And the notable absence of that, like, be careful. You know what I mean? Like, this isn't like permanent excuse from karmic entanglement and permanent excuse from normative, interpersonal responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Which, like, I don't know if that's commentary and stuff that shows up in other places, or the expectations that regulations and Sangha are going to take care of that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to me that we don't see that baked into this teaching here,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I also don't know who they were writing their commentaries for.
Right.
Were these notes to themselves, for themselves? Was it for a monastic community? Was it for a wider audience? Were the commentaries coming at the end of an Anga where the Diamond Sutra was the sole focus of the teaching for 90 days? It's hard to tell.
Yeah, and red pine is like collecting some component of like lots and lots of stuff that he could be collating. Like we're seeing his selected commentary, but it's just interesting to me that it breaks like that.
Yeah. And some of it is, he definitely is curating his commentary. And I would say sometimes we need that as encouragement, that lack of, I don't want to say lack of moral responsibility, but just the celebration of, like, this is a big thing. And getting to the place where you have this view is a big thing. It's also good to have the cautionary, don't screw it up. Yeah, it's good to point that out. Thank you.
I think this is another good example of how, like, the thing you started at the beginning of class, or on some people aren't ready to hear something yet. I remember, and this was like one of the reflections I started to write and then discarded it. But about 1.5 years ago, I was in Sanzen with a teacher, and I was talking about struggling with forgiveness. And I was thinking of a specific person in a specific situation where great harm was done to me, and I was having a hard time really sincerely cultivating forgiveness. And I didn't talk about the specifics of the situation. I just talked about it like I just did in general terms. And this particular teacher cited Roshi Baker out of San Francisco, who was very unskillful with his female students. And from what I understand, never really took responsibility for that, kind of went with the it's all good approach, or it's all empty. Anyway, that's what the teacher cited to me. He said, well, everything is empty, so there's nothing to forgive. And cited Baker saying that. And I almost laughed in the interview because I thought Baker is like basically the last teacher you should be citing to me right now with the specific thing that I'm trying to forgive for.
Yeah.
And it was helpful to, so I started to write about that when I was writing about these chapters, because 1.5 years later, I find that, I'm not going to turn to Baker as my teacher, but that idea that things are empty feels not dismissive, but hopeful, optimistic. Like, then I am Buddha nature. I'm not permanently damaged by anything that happened to me at some point a long time ago that is not happening right now.
Yeah.
But it was totally unskillful how he said it to me 1.5 years ago.
Yeah, sometimes teachers speak from the absolute view in such a way that students really need to hear from the conventional view. And sometimes that plants a seed. So in your case, that planted a seed that you recognize, you recognize something different now that you didn't know then about emptiness.
Yeah.
And I think that it's so contextual. Like what a skillful response is, it's so contextual that sometimes responding from the absolute view is exactly what the student needs, especially if they can be shocked out of a view that they're holding. And sometimes it can just cause more suffering.
So in this case, interestingly, I had a flash of understanding emptiness because I saw him as empty, even though he was wearing the gold robes and we were in the Sanzen room and I was bowing to him and all that. I thought, oh my God, this feels like patriarchy in the Sanzen room right now. Oh yeah, that's right. He's a man and he grew up in this country and he's gonna be his own dependent arising even as a teacher with the gold robes.
Yeah, we're all conditioned. Our view is conditioned by our own karma. So this points to like the fact that teachers can point the way, but it's still the student that has to do the work.
Mhm.
And if the teacher says something that seems out of alignment for the student, let that be a question. It doesn't have to be taken at face value. It can be a, what? You know, tuck it away and bring it out when it's useful. It might not ever be useful, but like, this is your practice. Thank you for sharing that. We got 6 more minutes. You're still muted, Laura. There you go.
Yeah, I wanted to press the right button, but toward the end of the reading, on page 279, and I really like how at the top it says, Yin Shun says it's like talking to a frog in a well about something as vast and boundless as the sky.
Yep.
And and then you read down, and basically it's that everybody kind of, it seems like all this has been leading up to that everybody's journey is their own personal journey, and that the concepts and the ideas are the goal, or are the point, but no words are actually going to capture what is basically an idea and what is a state of kind of flux in somebody's heart and in their mind. And so in that sense, it's pure and changeless because it exists beyond that. And I just really like that idea about that each person's journey is going to be really different, and all the we can get all wrapped up in the philosophical issues and the words and but at the end of the day, it's intense. It's intensely personal, but it's also universal at the same time, and that it's and that we have to kind of yes, we need to kind of understand what they're pointing to by reading about it, but at the same time, we kind of have to just trust that it's possible, and that we're going to understand it eventually, and just realize that it's a process of becoming. It isn't something you can actually study and like on a test and learn that 2 + 2 = 4. And I just found that to be a really interesting idea. And I don't know if I'm saying it the right way, but and they talk about how you wear a robe of the Buddha, that teaching the same, that you can wear the same robe as the Buddha, because you're practicing and you're working on the same things that the Buddha did. I just really found it to be a very hopeful and a very kind of telling ordinary people that they don't have to go get a PhD in dialectical philosophy to be able to undertake this journey.
I missed the last little bit you said because I had forgotten to play with my mouse and my computer went to sleep.
Okay, just that an ordinary person doesn't have to get a PhD in dialectical materialism and all of that business to undertake this journey, and that yes, that we can spend all this time on all of this, but at the end of the day, it's everybody's own personal journey with the ideas that.
Yes, you just encapsulated Zen quite lovely, in quite a lovely manner. It is deeply personal. It is deeply intimate. And in a way, what you're saying, Laura, reminds me of what we were talking about earlier with Choan in terms of having a visceral recognition, that body recognition. And that at some point, there may be some part of us that reads this, and the only thing that comes is a resounding yes of recognition. And that's beautiful. And then you turn around and try to explain it to somebody and say, don't get caught on my words, because my words aren't it. Cultivate your own sense of how to find that visceral yes.
And that's why poetry, I hope that the folks on the call that I hope you continue struggling with poetry, because I find that poetry kind of is the closest thing to what they're getting at here. A lot of the a lot of the poetry where it's just very short and it encapsulates the moment, right, with just a very few words. Kind of does that.
So here's your task. So for next class's reflection paper, do your page of reflections, and at the end, compose a 4-line verse that expresses some relationship to either the sutra as a whole or these chapters. And even though the reflection paper itself isn't shared, it would be great if we could all compose a 4-line poem and share it with each other at the next class when we meet in Sandy in 2 weeks. How does that sound? Reflection paper to be private, poems to be shared. All right. So in 2 weeks, we will cover chapters 17 through 20, and we'll be meeting in Sandy. All right. Thank you so much. I'll see you in 2 weeks, if not sooner.
Thank you, Joshin. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye. All right, good night, you guys.
No.